She ran into the forbidden bookstore, soaking wet and terrified. Her billionaire stalker was pounding on the glass, just seconds from breaking in. She turned to the mysterious owner and pledged her soul for protection. The unseelie king stood up, erased the entire building from the map, and looked her in the eye with a terrifying truth. You are safe from the mortal hunter, but you have just sold your freedom to the unseelie king. The rain in Seattle did not wash things clean, it merely varnished the grime, making the city slick and treacherous. Clara huddled deeper into her trench coat, the damp wool scratching against her neck, but the physical discomfort was a distant echo compared to the screaming panic in her chest. She checked her phone again. No signal. A small mercy, or perhaps a calculated dead zone. With Julian Thorne, one could never distinguish between bad luck and a meticulously executed algorithm. He didn't just own the tech sector, he infested it. Every camera, every microphone, every GPS ping was a nerve ending in a vast, digital nervous system that answered only to him. And right now, she felt his gaze pressing against her spine, heavier than the storm. She turned the corner sharply, her boots skidding on wet leaves. This wasn't the route to her apartment. She couldn't go home. Home was compromised. The smart locks she had installed a month ago, a gift from him, before she knew, had clicked open at 3 a.m. last night without her touching them. She had woken to the sound of breathing over the intercom. Just breathing. Measured, calm, possessive. It was the sound of a man who knew he had already won, a predator who enjoyed the hunt more than the kill. Clara had grabbed her bag, fled out the fire escape, and hadn't stopped moving since. The streets of the old district were narrower here, the sodium streetlights casting long, jaundiced yellow shadows that seemed to stretch and grasp at her ankles. She needed to disappear. Truly disappear. But in the 21st century, disappearance was a myth. You left a footprint every time you breathed near a Wi-Fi signal. She needed something analog. Something off the grid. That was when she saw it. Wedged between a derelict laundromat and a boarded-up electronics store was a narrow frontage of dark, polished mahogany that seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. The glass of the window was thick and rippled, distorting the interior into a blur of warm gold and shadow. Gold lettering, peeling but dignified, arched across the pane, the arcane Athenaeum. It shouldn't have been there. Clara had walked this street 1,000 times on her way to the university library, and she had never seen a bookstore here. It felt like a breathless pause in the city's frantic rhythm, a pocket of silence amidst the cacophony of traffic and rain. Without a conscious thought, her hand reached for the brass handle. It was cold, biting into her palm, vibrating with a low hum that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. She pushed. The door swung open with the heavy, well-oiled silence of a bank vault. The transition was jarring. The roar of the rain and the city vanished instantly, replaced by the scent of old parchment, beeswax, and something sharper, like ozone after a lightning strike. The air was dry and still, holding the hushed reverence of a cathedral. Floor-to-ceiling shelves loomed over her, packed with books bound in leather so dark it looked like dried blood or velvet the color of midnight. There were no paperbacks, no bestsellers tables, no fluorescent lights. Just the flickering glow of gas lamps bracketed to the walls, casting dancing shadows that looked too much like clawed hands. "We are closing," a voice said. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a baritone so deep it felt like it resonated in the floorboards. Clara jumped, spinning around. In the back of the shop, behind a massive desk of carved obsidian, sat a man. He didn't look up from the book he was reading. His skin was pale, the color of moonlight on snow, contrasting sharply with hair as black as the ink on the pages before him. He wore a suit, but it was cut in a style that defied the current decade, perhaps even the current century, with sharp, severe lines that accentuated the breadth of his shoulders. "Please," Clara gasped, her voice cracking. She realized she was shaking, dripping water onto the pristine Persian rug. I need a moment. Please." The man slowly lifted his head. Clara forgot how to breathe. His eyes were not human. They were a swirling, turbulent gray, like a storm trapped in glass, with no division between iris and pupil. They pinned her in place, dissecting her, stripping away the layers of her fear to look at something beneath. He was devastatingly beautiful, but it was a terrible, sharp beauty, the kind that warned of danger. The kind that belonged to apex predators. "This is not a shelter for strays," he said, his voice cool and devoid of empathy. He closed the book with a soft thud. "You bring chaos with you, girl. The air around you tastes of panic and silicon." "He's following me," Clara blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. She stepped further into the room, as if distance from the door would save her. "Julian. He tracks everything. I didn't know where else to go. The signal, it stopped when I came near the door. Please. I have money. I can pay." The man stood up. He was tall, unnaturally so, unfolding with a fluid grace that made him seem to loom over the room. He walked around the desk, his movements silent. "Money," he repeated, testing the word as if it were a foreign concept. "You offer me paper and metal? You have stepped out of the world of commerce, little bird, and into something far older." He stopped a few feet from her. The air grew colder. "You have the sight," he observed, tilting his head. "You do not know it, but you see the edges of things. That is why you found the door. That is why the warding did not burn you when you touched the handle." Clara blinked, confusion warring with terror. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just need a place to hide until morning. Just until the storm breaks." "The storm outside is nothing," the man said softly. He reached out, a long, pale finger tracing the air an inch from her cheek without touching her. Clara felt a spark, a static shock that smelled of winter air. "The storm following you is man-made, obsessive, and wrought. But I am not a charity." A heavy thud echoed against the front door. Clara screamed, a strangled sound that died in her throat. She scrambled back, colliding with a shelf of books. "Open up," a voice called from the street. It was amplified, metallic, stripped of humanity. "Julian. Or one of his drones. Clara. I know you're in there. The thermal signature is distinct." She looked at the man, her eyes wide with pleading. "He'll kill me. Or worse, he'll lock me away in his glass tower and I'll never see the sun again. Please. Hide me." The man looked at the door, then back at her. A slow, cruel smile curved his lips. It wasn't a smile of kindness, it was the smile of a merchant who had just spotted a rare commodity. "I can hide you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can weave a shadow so deep that not even his satellites can find you. I can fold space around you so that you cease to exist in his world entirely. But the Athenaeum demands a price." "Anything," Clara sobbed. The handle of the door began to rattle violently. The wood groaned. "I'll pay anything." "Not money," he said, stepping closer, invading her personal space until all she could see were those storm-cloud eyes. "Service. You pledge yourself to the Athenaeum. You pledge yourself to me. You work until the debt is paid, however long I deem that to be. No questions. No refusal." "I pledge," she cried out, desperate as the glass in the front window began to spiderweb under a heavy blow. "I pledge service to you. Just help me." "Name it," he commanded. "Say the words." "I pledge my service to Alistair, keeper of the Athenaeum, in exchange for sanctuary." "I pledge my service to Alistair, keeper of the Athenaeum, in exchange for sanctuary." Clara shouted, the words tearing from her throat. Thunder clapped, but it didn't come from outside. It exploded within the room, a soundless concussion of power that rattled Clara's teeth. The gas lamps flared brilliant violet, then settled back to gold. Alistair's eyes glowed, the gray swirling into a luminous silver. "Done," Alistair whispered. He turned to the door. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't chant. He simply exhaled a long, weary breath. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves from the walls. They were not merely absence of light, they were physical things, thick and oily, slithering across the floor like living ink. They rushed toward the door, seeping into the cracks, coating the glass, sealing the wood. Outside, the banging stopped instantly. The mechanical voice was cut off mid-syllable. Silence slammed back into place, absolute and heavy. Clara slid down the bookshelf, her legs giving out, landing hard on the floor. She gasped for air, clutching her chest. Is he gone? Alistair looked down at her, his expression unreadable. To him, this building no longer exists. He is looking at a brick wall between a laundromat and an empty lot. He will search the city for 1,000 years and never find the door again unless I wish it. He offered her a hand. His fingers were long, ringed with silver bands etched with runes she couldn't read. Up, Clara, he said. You're safe from the mortal hunter. But you have just sold your freedom to the unseelie king. Clara stared at his hand, her mind reeling. Unseelie king. The words meant nothing to her, yet they carried a weight that made her bones ache. She took his hand. His skin was ice-cold, hard as marble. He pulled her up with effortless strength. I don't understand, she whispered. You will, Alistair said, turning back to his desk. The tea on the side table is for you. Drink it. It will stop the shaking. Tomorrow, your work begins. You are the archivist now. What do I archive? She asked, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving her cold and hollow. Alistair picked up his book again. Memories. Regrets. Bargains struck in desperation. He looked at her one last time, and, for a second, the harshness in his eyes softened into something that looked almost like pity. And the names of those foolish enough to trust the Fae. Clara looked around the shop. The shadows seemed to be breathing, watching her. She had escaped a cage of glass and silicon only to walk into one of velvet and shadow. But as she sipped the tea, which tasted of honey and lavender and something dark, like earth, she realized her hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in months, the feeling of being watched by a camera was gone. But she was still being watched. The days that followed bled into one another, dissolving the concept of time. There were no clocks in the Athenaeum. The light outside the rippled glass remained a perpetual, gloomy twilight, suggesting it was always raining, always evening. Clara learned quickly that the Athenaeum was not merely a shop, it was a nexus. The books on the shelves shifted. Sometimes she would turn a corner in the stacks and find herself in a section that hadn't been there an hour ago, smelling of desert sand or ocean salt. She worked. Alistair was an exacting master, though not cruel in the way Julian had been. Julian's cruelty was hot, suffocating, a constant pressure to be perfect, to be his. Alistair's cruelty was cold, indifferent. He ignored her for days, leaving lists of tasks on the obsidian desk, dust the section on draconic treaties. Feed the carnivorous orchids in the conservatory, do not use bare hands. Sort the vials of bottled starlight by luminescence. Clara obeyed. She found a rhythm in the strangeness. And she found that the sight Alistair had mentioned was real. When she touched certain books, she saw flashes, images of the authors, the emotions they poured into the ink. A treatise on war made her weep. A book of sonnets made her feel the warmth of a lover's touch. It was overwhelming, but it was also the first time she had felt powerful. Julian had loved her for her beauty, for the way she looked on his arm at galas. Alistair didn't care what she looked like. He cared about what she could do. But the piece was a fragile illusion. It shattered 2 weeks after her arrival. Clara was shelving a heavy tome on ley line mechanics when the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the soft tinkle that announced a wayward customer. It was a deep, mournful toll, like a funeral knell. Alistair materialized from the shadows near the counter, his face grim. He was wearing a coat of dark velvet, high-collared and regal. He looked less like a shopkeeper and more like the monarch he claimed to be. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice vibrating with a low growl. The door opened. It didn't stick or creak. It opened wide, admitting a gust of wind that smelled of frost and rotting flowers. A woman stepped inside. She was blinding. Her hair was spun gold, her skin glowing with an inner light that was painful to look at. She wore a suit of white silk that looked sharp enough to cut, tailored to perfection. But it was her eyes that froze Clara's blood. They were blue, bright and pitiless as a winter sky. And behind her, holding a tablet, looking bored and irritated, was a man in a gray tactical suit. He wasn't Fae. He was human. But his eyes were glazed, staring at nothing. "Mab," Alistair said, the name a curse. You are far from your court of light. And you are hiding stolen property, Alistair, the woman purred. Her voice was like crystal wind chimes, beautiful and grating. She stepped further in, her heels clicking on the floorboards. The accord is quite clear on the abduction of mortals who belong to others. Alistair crossed his arms. She came to me. She bargained. She is under my protection. Mab laughed, a sound like breaking glass. She is Fae-touched, yes. A rare breed. But she has a prior claim. She gestured to the door. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Julian walked in. He looked exactly as he had the last time she saw him, impeccable, handsome, terrifying. But there was something wrong. His eyes were too bright, his movements too smooth. And around his neck hung a pendant, a shard of glowing ice that pulsed in time with Mab's heartbeat. "Hello, Clara," Julian said. His voice was calm, reasonable. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble. But Queen Mab and I have come to an arrangement. She helps me retrieve what is mine, and I help her modernize her influence." Clara stepped up from behind Alistair, her fear momentarily eclipsed by shock. You can see this place? Technology catches up to magic eventually, my dear," Julian smiled, tapping the ice pendant. "With a little assistance. Now, come along. The car is waiting." "She is not going anywhere," Alistair said. The shadows in the room rose up, forming jagged spikes behind him. She swore an oath. "And I am challenging it," Mab interrupted, her smile sharp as a razor. "I invoke the Fae Accord Council. A trial of ownership. The mortal's fate will be decided by the High Court." She looked at Clara with predatory amusement. "If we win, she returns to Mr. Thorne. If you win, well, we shall see." Alistair went rigid. To refuse the council was war. To accept was to gamble everything. He looked at Clara. The indifference was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fierce, protective heat. "Accepted," Alistair snarled. The silence that followed their departure was not the peaceful quiet of the library. It was the vacuum left after a bomb fails to detonate, the air thick with unspent violence. Clara stood rooted to the spot. The image of Julian standing beside the Fae Queen burned into her retinas. He had looked at her not with love, not even with his usual terrifying obsession, but with the proprietary calculation of a man checking the stock market. He had merged his sterile, digital world with something ancient and rotting, and the result was a monstrosity she couldn't name. Alistair did not move for a long time. He stared at the space where Mab had stood, his jaw set in a line of granite. The shadows that had bristled like spikes slowly softened, pulling back into the corners of the room, but they remained agitated, swirling like ink in water. He had a necklace," Clara whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "It was glowing." "Ice from the winter court," Alistair said, his voice distant. He turned slowly to face her. The stormy gray of his eyes had darkened to charcoal. "Mab is not merely helping him, she is arming him. She has given a mortal man the keys to the back door of reality." "He called me property," Clara said, a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. "He thinks he owns me. And now he has magic." "He has borrowed power," Alistair corrected sharply, crossing the room to her. He stopped just short of touching her, his presence a wall of cold, reassuring solidity. "There is a difference, Clara. Magic born of blood and soil is a river. It flows, it gives, it takes. Magic borrowed is a debt. And Mab is a loan shark who collects in marrow and soul." He looked down at her, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of genuine concern beneath the imperious mask. "I apologized. I did not think you would find the means to pierce the veil. I underestimated the depths of human entitlement." "What does a trial mean?" Clara asked, hugging herself. "Do I have to testify? Do I have to go back to him if you lose?" "The Fae Accord Council is not a court of law as you know it," Alistair explained, pacing away from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "It is a theater of truth. Lies cannot be spoken there without burning the tongue. Oaths cannot be broken without shattering the bone. Mab has invoked the right of ownership. She claims you are a stolen asset, a Fae-touched human bound to her ally. I claim you are a supplicant who pledged service to the unseelie court. He paused, turning to look at a row of books bound in silver leather. If we lose, yes. You return to him. And, because the judgment is binding by magic, I would be physically unable to stop him from taking you. The Athenaeum would bar you from entry forever. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. And if we win? Alistair looked at her, his gaze intense. Then you belong to me. Wholly. Until I release you. The weight of his words hung between them. To belong to Julian was to be a bird in a gilded cage, monitored, controlled, clipped. To belong to Alistair, she didn't know what that meant yet. But she remembered the way he had offered her tea for the shock. She remembered the silence he allowed her. She remembered that he had asked for her pledge, not taken it by force. I choose you, Clara said, her voice small but steady. Alistair's eyes widened slightly, the pupils dilating. He stepped closer, the air between them charging with that static ozone scent. Be careful, little bird, he murmured, his voice dropping to a husk. You choose the monster you know over the monster you don't. But do not mistake me for a savior. I am the king of the unseelie. My court is the court of shadows, of nightmares, of the things that go bump in the dark. We are not kind. You hid me, Clara countered, looking up at him, refusing to flinch. You gave me a job. You didn't track my phone. You didn't watch me sleep. I'll take nightmares over surveillance any day. A ghost of a smile touched Alistair's lips, not the cruel merchant's smile from before, but something fainter, sadder. Very well. Then we must prepare. We leave for the Undercity within the hour. The Undercity? The neutral ground between the courts, he said, turning toward a spiral staircase in the back of the shop that Clara had never seen before. Where the council sits. Go upstairs. You will find clothing laid out on the bed. Wear it. Your mortal clothes scream of prey. If you are to stand before the council as my archivist, you must look like you belong to the shadows. Clara climbed the stairs, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room at the top was not a bedroom, but a sanctuary. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting star charts and forests that glowed with bioluminescence. On a massive four-poster bed carved from black wood lay a dress. It was breathtaking. It was made of a material that seemed to shift from black to midnight blue to deep violet, like the sky just after sunset. It wasn't a princess dress. It was structured, high-necked, with long sleeves that ended in points over the back of the hands. It looked like armor disguised as silk. Clara shed her damp jeans and oversized sweater, the clothes of a fugitive, and slipped into the gown. It fitted perfectly, molding to her form without restricting her. As she fastened the silver clasps at the bodice, she felt a change. The fabric was cool against her skin, and it seemed to dampen her fear, wrapping her in a layer of calm. She looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the terrified girl who had run from a tech mogul. She looked regal, severe, and dangerous. When she descended the stairs, Alistair was waiting. He had changed as well. Gone was the Victorian shopkeeper's suit, replaced by a tunic of black leather and silver chainmail, covered by a flowing cloak of shadowcloth that seemed to smoke at the edges. A crown of twisted iron and black diamonds rested on his brow. He looked terrifying. He looked magnificent. He watched her come down, his eyes tracking every step. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and Clara saw raw hunger in his gaze, a longing so deep and ancient it made her breath hitch. But he blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the cool resolve of a king going to war. Adequate, he said, though his voice was roughly textured. You look like the night itself. How do we get there? Clara asked, smoothing the skirts of her gown. We walk, Alistair said. He walked to the center of the rug and stomped his heel once. The floorboards groaned, and then, impossibly, they began to part. They didn't break, they dissolved, melting away to reveal a swirling vortex of mist and starlight beneath the shop. It was a hole in the world. Give me your hand, he commanded, extending his arm. Do not let go. The space between realms is hungry. It likes to swallow those who wander. Clara took his hand. His grip was iron-hard, anchoring her. Ready? No, she admitted. Good, Alistair said. Fear keeps you sharp. And he pulled her into the void. The sensation was not like falling, it was like being unmade. There was no up or down, only a rushing wind that whispered in 1,000 dead languages. Colors flashed past, colors that the human eye wasn't meant to see, violets that burned and greens that tasted of copper. Clara felt her sense of self stretching, thinning, as if she were being pulled into taffy. She gripped Alistair's hand so hard her knuckles ached. He was the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. He was the lighthouse. "Look at me," his voice cut through the roar, clear and immediate, as if he were speaking inside her skull. "Focus on me, Clara. Do not look at the shapes in the mist." She forced her eyes to lock onto his. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp against the swirling madness, his expression one of intense concentration. He was shielding her, she realized. The shadows of his cloak were flared out, forming a protective cocoon around them, deflecting the grasping tendrils of the void. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the motion stopped. They landed on solid stone. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of ozone and ancient dust. Clara stumbled, her knees buckling, but Alistair caught her, his arms sweeping around her waist to hold her upright. "Breathe," he instructed. "The air here is richer. It intoxicates mortals if they gulp it." Clara took a shallow breath. They were standing on a massive circular platform of white marble, floating in a cavern so vast the ceiling was lost to darkness. Around them, bridges of spun glass arched over an abyss that glowed with a faint, eerie blue light. In the distance, a citadel rose from the stone, a sprawling architecture of spires, flying buttresses, and impossible geometry, half-lit by 3 pale moons that hung in a starless sky. "The Hall of Accords," Alistair said, releasing her slowly, though he kept his body angled to shield her from the open drop. "The neutral territory of the Fae. It's big," Clara managed, feeling incredibly small. "It is the graveyard of empires," Alistair muttered. "Come. They will be waiting." They walked across the glass bridge. Clara didn't dare look down. Ahead, the massive doors of the citadel were open, flanked by guards who were definitely not human. They were tall, with skin like bark or polished stone, holding halberds that hummed with energy. They dipped their heads as Alistair passed, a ripple of unease moving through them. The unseelie king was feared here. Inside, the hall was a cavernous amphitheater. Tiers of stone benches rose high into the shadows, filled with a kaleidoscope of creatures. There were beings of pure light, beautiful and terrible, creatures of fur and claw, things that looked like walking trees. The air buzzed with 1,000 whispered conversations. In the center of the amphitheater was a circle of black sand. And standing on the far side of it was Julian. He looked incongruous, a man in a bespoke Italian suit standing amidst high fantasy monsters. Yet, he didn't look afraid. He looked arrogant. He was typing on his phone, the blue light of the screen illuminating his face. Beside him sat Queen Mab on a throne of woven ice, looking bored and lethal. The defendant approaches, a booming voice echoed from a high podium. Alistair led Clara into the circle of sand. The moment her foot touched the grit, a wall of invisible force slammed up around the perimeter, sealing them in. The noise of the crowd vanished, replaced by a focused, terrifying silence. 3 figures sat on the high podium, the judges. One was a woman made of living fire, her hair a cascade of flames. One was a man whose skin was a mosaic of river stones. And the center figure was a being of pure shadow, faceless and robed in gray. Alistair of the Unseelie, the shadow judge spoke, its voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "You stand accused of harboring a mortal claimed by the Seelie ally. How do you plead?" "I plead the law of sanctuary," Alistair's voice rang out, projecting without effort to the furthest seats. The mortal Clara entered the Athenaeum of her own will. She offered a pledge of service. By the ancient laws, a pledge freely given supersedes a claim of implicit ownership. "She is mentally unwell." Julian's voice cut in. He stepped forward, putting his phone away. He played the role perfectly, the concerned, grieving partner. "Hi, judges. Clara has suffered a breakdown. She suffers from delusions. She ran from her home, from her doctors. This man took advantage of a vulnerable woman in a fugue state. Her pledge is void because she was not of sound mind to make it. Clara felt rage, hot and sharp, pierce through her fear. It was his oldest trick. Gaslighting. Telling everyone she was crazy so that anything she said about his abuse would be dismissed as paranoia. "I am not crazy," Clara said. Her voice was small in the vast hall. "Speak up, child," the fire judge commanded. Clara stepped away from Alistair. She felt his hand twitch, wanting to pull her back, but he let her go. She had to do this. "I am not crazy," she said louder, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I ran because he stalks me. He installed cameras in my home. He tracked my vitals. He isolated me from my friends. I went to the Athenaeum because it was the only place his signal couldn't reach. I pledged to Alistair because he offered me safety, not a cage." Julian sighed, a sound of tragic patience. He looked at the judges. "See? Paranoia. She thinks I, a man who runs a global communication network, am stalking her. I was protecting her. Clara is special." He turned his eyes to her, and for a second, the facade dropped. The obsession was there, naked and ugly. She has the sight. She sees the code behind the world. "I need her back so I can care for her." "He lies," Alistair said, stepping up beside Clara. "He does not want to care for her. He wants to harvest her. He is working with the CLI Queen to bridge magic and technology. Clara is his prototype." Mab stood up, her ice throne cracking. "Careful, Unseelie. Accusations of treason against the Accord require proof." "We shall have proof," the stone judge rumbled. The trial of truth is invoked. The floor of the arena shifted. The black sand began to swirl. "The trial is simple," the shadow judge announced. "The claimant and the defendant shall each present their truth. The magic of the circle will weigh it. If you lie, the sand will flay the flesh from your bones. If you speak truth, you shall stand." Julian smiled. It was a terrifying, confident smile. He touched the ice pendant at his throat. "Alistair," Clara whispered, panic rising. "He's planning something. He's not scared. He believes his technology can trick the magic," Alistair murmured, his eyes locked on Julian. "He believes he can hack the truth." "Can he?" Alistair looked at her. "The magic of the Fae is old, Clara. But it is rigid. It follows rules. If he has found a way to bend the rules, then we burn," Clara finished. "I will not let you burn," Alistair vowed, his voice low and fierce. "If the sand rises against you, I will tear this arena apart before I let it touch you." "That would be war," she said. "You are worth a war," he replied simply. The admission hit her harder than the teleportation had. He meant it. This immortal, terrifying king was willing to break the world for her. And she realized, with a jolt of clarity, that she was willing to fight for him too. Not just for her freedom, but for him. "Let the trial begin," the fire judge roared. Julian stepped forward first. The sand hissed around his polished shoes. He spread his hands, the picture of innocence. "I love Clara," Julian said. The sand rippled. It crawled up his shoe, dusty and gray. It hovered there, waiting. It did not attack. Clara gasped. "He believes it." In his sick, twisted mind, he actually believes it. "A lie believed is still a lie to the cosmos," Alistair growled. "But his pendant, look." Clara squinted. The ice pendant on Julian's chest was pulsing with a rhythmic, strobe-like light. It was emitting a frequency. The sand around his feet seemed confused, vibrating in a chaotic pattern, unable to form a judgment. He was jamming the magical signal. "He is cheating," Clara hissed. "Technically," Mab's voice floated across the arena, "he is merely enhancing his aura. There is no rule against accessories." "My turn," Alistair said. He stepped forward. He didn't need accessories. He simply stood in his power, a pillar of darkness. "Clara is free," Alistair said. The sand rushed toward him, swirling around his legs, caressing the hem of his cloak. It settled instantly. "Truth. She sought sanctuary, and I granted it," Alistair continued. "She is not property. She is a soul. Truth." The sand lay flat. "Your turn, little bird," Alistair said gently, stepping back to let her take the center. Clara walked into the middle of the circle. She felt the gaze of thousands of creatures on her. She felt Julian's eyes boring into her skull. "I am afraid of Julian Thorne," she said. The sand lay still. "Truth. He hurt me," she said. "Truth. He." She hesitated. She looked at Julian. He was smirking, tapping his pendant. He was winning simply by not losing. If he could stall the judgment, Mab would use the deadlock to force a custody rulings. She needed to expose him. She needed to break the jammer. Clara closed her eyes. "You have the sight," Alistair had said. "You see the edges of things." She took a deep breath and focused. Not on the faces in the crowd, not on the sand, but on the air itself. She looked for the structure. She pushed past the fear, past the panic, and looked. The world shifted. The stone benches became wire frames of energy. The lights became streams of photons. And Julian. Julian was a void. But around his neck, the pendant was a screaming knot of jagged, discordant lines. It wasn't just CLI magic. It was wrong. It was corrupted. It looked like oil slick on water, iridescent and sickly. It was pumping a sludge-like energy into the ground, poisoning the sand, confusing it. And connected to that pendant, trailing like a leash back to the shadows behind the CLI throne, was a thick, pulsating cable of dark, greenish light. It wasn't Mab holding the leash. Clara opened her eyes. She stared directly at the empty space behind Mab's throne. To everyone else, it was empty. To her, there was a shimmering distortion, a massive, hunched figure cloaked in optical camouflage. "He is not just using CLI magic," Clara shouted, her voice ringing out with sudden, absolute certainty. "He is using Fomorian tech." The entire hall gasped. Even the judges leaned forward. The Fomorians were the ancient enemies of the Fae, the chaotic monsters banished to the deep sea and the void. Their magic was forbidden. To use it was the highest treason. Absurd. Mab stood up, her composure cracking. "The girl is hallucinating." "I see it." Clara pointed a shaking finger at the empty space behind Mab. There is a dampener field. He's feeding the pendant from a generator hidden in the shadows." Julian's smirk vanished. He tapped his phone frantically. "Alistair," Clara yelled. "Behind the throne. 3 feet to the left. Strike it." Alistair didn't hesitate. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't look for himself. He trusted her. He raised his hand, and a spear of pure, condensed shadow materialized in his grip. With a roar that shook the foundations of the citadel, he hurled it. The spear flew past Julian, past Mab, and slammed into the empty air behind the throne. There was a metallic screech, the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass. Sparks real, electric sparks, showered the arena. The optical camouflage flickered and died, revealing a hideous, squat machine made of rusted brass and pulsating green flesh, manned by a creature that looked like a toad crossbred with a tank. The crowd erupted into chaos. "Treason!" The fire judge screamed, rising to her full height, her hair igniting into a tower of flame. Fomorian technology within the Hall of Accords. The jammer died. The connection to Julian's pendant severed. Instantaneously, the black sand at Julian's feet woke up. It realized it had been lied to. It realized it had been tricked. It didn't just rise. It exploded. Julian screamed as the sand lashed out, wrapping around his ankles, his knees, dragging him down. It wasn't just sand anymore. It was judgment given physical form. "Mab!" Julian shrieked, clawing at the ground. "Help me!" Mab looked at the exposed machine, then at the furious judges. She looked at Julian, who was rapidly sinking into the crushing grit. The calculation in her eyes took less than a second. She sat back down and smoothed her dress. "I have no idea who this man is," she said coldly. "Clearly, he deceived us all." Julian's eyes went wide with betrayal. The sand reached his chest. "Clara," he begged, staring at her, tears streaming down his face, perhaps the first real emotion he had shown in years. "Clara, stop it. Please." Clara stood over him. She looked at the man who had terrorized her, who had tried to own her, who had almost sold the safety of the world for control. She felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, like looking at a dying insect. "I can't stop the truth, Julian," she said softly. "You did this." The sand rose over his mouth, silencing his pleas. Then his nose. Then his eyes. And then, with a final, sickening crunch, the sand solidified. It turned from black grit into solid, transparent crystal. Julian was trapped inside, frozen in a scream, a statue of his own hubris, preserved for eternity in the center of the Fae court. Silence fell over the hall. The Formorian creature behind the throne was already being dragged away by guards. The shadow judge stood. "The trial is concluded. The truth is made manifest. The mortal Julian Thorne is guilty of treason and deceit. His sentence is eternal imprisonment within the mirror of truth." The judge turned its eyeless face to Clara. "The mortal Clara is vindicated. She is free of all claims." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. Her knees gave way. Alistair was there instantly, catching her before she hit the ground. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking, she realized. The King of Nightmares was trembling. "You did it," he whispered into her ear. "You saw what no one else could see." "Is it over?" she mumbled into his tunic, smelling the leather and the storm. "The trial is over," Alistair said, pulling back to look at her. His expression was fierce, proud, and undeniably possessive. "But everything else is just beginning." He looked at the crystal prison of Julian Thorne, then back at the judges. "We are leaving," Alistair announced. "The archivist has work to do." The return journey through the void was different. The chaotic winds that had screamed at them on the way down now seemed to part deferentially, whispering in hushed tones. Alistair did not hold her hand to anchor her this time. He held it because he refused to let go. When they stepped back onto the familiar Persian rug of the Athenaeum, the silence of the shop felt heavier, charged with the unsaid. The floorboards knit themselves back together, sealing the breach to the Undercity. The gas lamps flickered low, casting long, intimate shadows. Clara stepped away from the circle, her legs feeling heavy, not with fear, but with the exhaustion of an adrenaline crash. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking slightly. She had stood before gods and monsters and spoken truth to power. She had dismantled a billionaire's empire with a single sentence. "Drink," Alistair said, pressing a glass of amber liquid into her hand. It wasn't tea this time. It was brandy, old and rich. Clara took a sip. It burned pleasantly, grounding her. She looked up at him. He had removed the iron crown, setting it carelessly on a stack of encyclopedias, but the cloak of shadow still swirled around his shoulders. He looked tired, the immortality in his face etched with a very human weariness. "He's really gone?" she asked softly. "He is preserved," Alistair corrected, leaning against his desk, watching her with an intensity that made the air hum. "Julian Thorne is a monument now. He will never hunt again. The Sealy court has disavowed him to save face. His assets, his empire, are currently without a king. It will crumble," Clara said, staring into the amber liquid. "Without him, the algorithms will degrade. The board will panic." "Let them," Alistair said dismissively. "The affairs of mortals are dust in the wind." "Not to me," Clara said. She looked around the shop, at the books she had come to know, at the dust motes dancing in the light. "That was my life. The fear, the running, it defined me for so long. Now there's just a blank space." Alistair pushed off the desk and walked toward her. He stopped a foot away, respectful of the distance but commanding it. He reached into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a piece of parchment, the contract she had signed in desperation the night she arrived. The ink was still wet, glistening with the magic that bound her to him. He held it up between them. "You pledged service for sanctuary," Alistair said, his voice low. "You bought your life with your freedom. That was the bargain." Clara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I remember." "The bargain is concluded," Alistair said. With a flick of his wrist, the parchment ignited. It didn't burn with orange fire, but with a cool, silver flame that consumed the paper without heat. Ash drifted to the floor, dissolving before it hit the rug. "You are released, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of inflection, though his eyes were storm-tossed oceans. "The threat is neutralized. The debt is paid. You are free to leave the Athenaeum. You are free to walk out that door and never see the shadows again." Clara stared at the empty space where the contract had been. She felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest, a sense of loss she hadn't expected. "You're kicking me out?" "I am giving you what you asked for," Alistair said, his jaw tightening. "Safety. Freedom. You can go back to the sun. You can reclaim your life, Clara. You can find a home that doesn't smell of old paper and ozone. You can find a man who is warm, who ages, who doesn't carry the weight of a dead kingdom on his back." "And if I don't want a man who is warm?" Clara challenged, the words slipping out before she could check them. Alistair went still. The shadows around him seemed to hold their breath. "Do not toy with me, Archivist. I am old and I am selfish. If you stay, I will not let you go a second time." Clara stepped into the space between them, closing the distance he had so carefully maintained. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had pulled her from the void, the hand that had thrown a spear of darkness to save her life. His skin was cool, but beneath it, she felt the thrum of power, a heartbeat that was slower and stronger than a human's. "I spent my whole life being told who I was," Clara said, her voice steady. "Julian told me I was a doll. The world told me I was a victim. But here, with you, I'm the Archivist. I have the sight. I saw the machine when the Queen of the Fae couldn't. I have power here." She looked up into his gray eyes, seeing the vulnerability he hid behind the regal mask. "I don't want to go back to being blind," she whispered. "And I don't want to be anywhere you aren't." Alistair made a sound half groan, half growl, and his restraint snapped. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her knees weak. "I have waited," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers, "a very long time for someone who could see the dark and not run from it." He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, storybook kiss. It was a claiming. It tasted of the brandy, of the storm, of ancient magic and desperate need. It was the slow burn finally igniting, a consuming fire that swept through her, burning away the last remnants of the fear Julian had planted in her. In Alistair's arms, she wasn't prey. She was an equal. She was the anchor to his storm. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Alistair kept his arms around her, as if ensuring she was real. "So," he said, his voice rough, "if you are staying, we have a problem." Clara smiled, touching his cheek. "What problem?" "The Sealy court knows you now," he said, stroking her hair. "Mab will not forget that a mortal humiliated her. You cannot simply be an archivist anymore. You need a title. You need protection that even the High Council cannot question." Clara pulled back slightly, her mind racing. The sight flickered at the edge of her vision, showing her threads of possibility. She thought of Julian's empire, leaderless, chaotic, but built on a foundation of global surveillance and communication. She thought of the Fae, powerful but archaic, struggling to understand the modern world. Julian's company, she said, the idea forming rapidly. Technologic. It's legally in limbo. But I know his passwords. I know the encryption keys. I saw them in the patterns when I looked at him during the trial. I can see the digital architecture just like I see the magic. Alistair raised an eyebrow. And Clara said, a dangerous, confident smile spreading across her face, "I'm going to take it. Not as his victim, but as his successor. I'll dismantle the stalking networks, the spyware. I'll repurpose it. The Fae need a bridge to the modern world, Alistair. You said it yourself, Mab was trying to buy a back door. I can build a front door. One we control." Alistair looked at her, stunned admiration dawning in his eyes. "You would seize the Iron Throne of the mortal world?" "I'm going to turn it into an embassy," Clara declared. "I'll be the liaison. The ambassador between the arcane and the digital. I'll keep the Fae's secrets, and I'll keep the humans safe from things they don't understand." Alistair threw his head back and laughed, a rich, deep sound that filled the Athenaeum, banishing the gloom. "The ambassador. It suits you. Mab will be furious. It will be delightful. He took her hand and kissed the knuckles. Very well. The Athenaeum is yours, Clara. The resources of the Unseelie Court are at your disposal. Take the empire. Rule it. The boardroom of Thorn Enterprises was located on the 45th floor, encased in glass that offered a panoramic view of the rainy Seattle skyline. The board members, a collection of gray-suited men who had served Julian's whims for years, sat in nervous silence. The chair at the head of the table was empty. The double doors opened. Clara walked in. She wasn't wearing the oversized sweaters she used to hide in. She wore a suit of dark charcoal, tailored sharp as a knife, with a blouse of deep violet silk underneath. On her finger sat a ring of heavy silver and black diamond, a signet of the Unseelie Court. She didn't walk like a fugitive. She walked like a queen. Behind her, silently, moved a figure that made the board members shift uncomfortably. Alistair, dressed in a modern suit that still managed to look like Victorian armor, stood at her right hand, his eyes scanning the room with predatory grace. Clara reached the head of the table. She didn't sit. She placed her hands on the mahogany surface, the same way Alistair had placed his hands on his desk the night they met. "Gentlemen," Clara said, her voice clear and commanding. "There have been some changes to the leadership structure." "Ms. Clara," the CFO stammered. "We were under the impression that Mr. Thorne was indisposed. We have questions about the legal standing of—" "Mr. Thorne is serving a life sentence," Clara interrupted smoothly. "And as the primary shareholder and the individual holding the encryption keys to the entire network, I am assuming control effective immediately." She tapped the table. The screens embedded in the wall flared to life, displaying code that reorganized itself into a new logo and stylized eye within a labyrinth. "We are pivoting," Clara announced. "We are no longer in the business of surveillance. We are in the business of protection. We are going to secure the boundaries of this world." She looked at Alistair. He gave her a barely perceptible nod, his pride radiating like heat. Clara looked back at the men who had once terrified her by proxy. She saw their fear, their confusion, their smallness. She saw the threads of their ambition and their greed. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she could handle them. She had bargained with the Fae King. She had stared down the Winter Queen. She had trapped a monster in crystal. This was just business. "Any questions?" Clara asked, her smile sharp, beautiful, and full of teeth. Silence. "Good," Clara said. "Let's get to work." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city, but inside the glass tower, the shadows were no longer something to fear. They were allies. And in the reflection of the window, Clara saw herself standing beside her king, two worlds, one power, and a future written in ink and magic.